Hello, and thank you so much for joining me. It's lovely to see you guys.
Pleasure.
You too.
We are here today as the musical team of Her War, a new opera for the 2020 Tête-à-Tête Festival about the female experience of PTSD. And huge welcome to our wonderful composer, Edwin Roxburgh, and to our fabulous trumpeter, Simon Desbruslais. We are going to kick off today by talking a little bit about how the project came to be, and then Edwin has very kindly agreed to open a window into his creative process for us to talk a little bit about how he tends to structure his works, if he's working with text, how he sets that to music, and then delve more into how he's done that for Her War, and talk a little bit about some of the particular challenges for this project and some of the joys for all of us that we've discovered thus far in the process. So, I'm going to actually start with a question to Simon. How did this project come about?
Yeah, so April, I've been thinking about this, and I can't. I mean, this is one of those things where it gets quite hazy as to who came up with what first. So I had my own route into this, and I think you did as well. So
Yeah.
for me, I've been for about the last 15 years, I've been commissioning music that's quite closely based on a particular collaboration. So I had one big project around 2012 that was the Trumpet Concerto project. So that was specifically with an orchestra, with a set of people. And then I've had, a trumpet and piano project and a trumpet and organ or a trumpet and string quartet. And I think I've always wanted to do something with a soprano. And my main reasons for that are from the Baroque era. So we've got these incredible pieces with trumpet obbligato with the soprano aria, Let the Bright Seraphim from Handel Samson, Cantata 51 by Bach, and they just work so well. And I've never understood why more hasn't been done today with those sorts of combinations. And so that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, I've played a couple of times, not loads, but I've played a couple of times in orchestral pits for operas, and I'm pretty jealous. I'm pretty jealous of those singers up there, getting all of the attention. And I have thought, wouldn't it be fun? Wouldn't it be interesting if the trumpet got to go on the stage too? And so I think this is kind of, for me, it's a kind of colliding of those two ideas. One is I've always wanted to work with a soprano to do some new commissions. I've always wanted to be on a stage that is not just a concert platform, but in some way dramatic. So that's nothing to do with what the subject matter has actually ended up being for this piece. That's entirely about the kind of performance context for it and the kinds of people that I wanted to work with.
Whereas for me, I remember this all came about from the first set of drinks at the Barbican, where we were again talking about a completely different project. And we were talking about our research interests because we're both kind of researching performers, a rather rare creature in the UK. And I had spent my master's and doctoral work looking at the work of Ivor Gurney. So thinking a lot about how life was for soldiers in the trenches and what it was like for them to try and kind of put back the pieces coming back. And I just remember this moment when we looked at each other and thought, hey, what if we did an opera for soprano and trumpet about PTSD? And on one hand, we're like, that's absolutely crazy. Could that ever work? And we thought, let's try. And it's been this kind of journey of bringing it to fruition. But I remember that as we were thinking, who on earth could write this? Who would be the right person? I was really wanting to draw from your wealth of experience, both for people who write well for the trumpet, but also for voice. And Edwin was one of the first names that you came up with. I remember that very clearly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because I mean, I can't remember the year that we had this chat at the Barbican, but I think it wasn't too far off 2014. So 2014 was when Edwin and I had been working on a different piece, Pro Patria Mori for trumpet and piano on World War One themes. And so I think the connection of Edwin to World War One was quite fresh at the time. It seemed like quite an obvious link to make.
Indeed. Do you guys actually just want to take a moment to talk about your experience of doing that piece and kind of how you think it might have kind of fed into what we're doing now? Prepared for that?
Yeah, so I mean, Edwin, I feel like so Edwin and I first crossed paths at the Royal College of Music in I think it was 2005, Edwin. And Edwin was conducting the RCM New Perspectives Ensemble for a really, really hard violin concerto. I don't remember who wrote it. I feel like it was a postdoc student or PhD student or someone at the RCM at the time. And I remember that it also had this crazy hard trumpet part in it and loads of time signature changes. And I wasn't yet completely converted to contemporary music. And actually, it was working with Edwin as a conductor that really, really turned me into it, actually. Really turned my head into.
I wasn't aware that I corrupted you.
Yes, it's all on you. It was a great experience. I loved it because it was. I mean, you wouldn't expect to go looking for difficult trumpet repertoire in a violin concerto, but it was, and actually, it was a really stimulating experience because it was really hard, and it really got me thinking about things. And so it was then years later when I was working with pianist Claire Hammond that I thought, do you know what, I want to get in touch with Edwin about this and see if he fancies a trumpet and piano piece. I think that's how it happened, isn't it?
Sounds like it, yes, indeed. I wasn't aware you were at the concert there. That's quite an interesting revelation. So I'm very glad that we did meet up in that kind of way, because collaboration is not always easy. And I think the most important thing about a good collaboration is that the people involved have the same objective in mind, and also the same appreciation of the stylistic characteristics that they're involved in with any creative process. It's not always possible when you're, for instance, with a commission for a particular artist. I always find myself really thinking about that, as I did with your piece, Pro Patria Mori, as being a kind of portrait of the soloist you're writing for, and revealing things that perhaps the soloist, him or herself, is not necessarily aware. I think that's always a good aspect of a portrait, and musically it's possible to do as well, especially if you're not embroiled in a specific kind of the cult of the day, as it were, like minimalism, which I've always been revolted by, simply because it's uninventive. So really, the most important thing is that if I'm composing for a particular artist, I make sure that I know what characteristics that they're playing are most important to them personally, so that you can make a kind of subjective portrait of them in the performance. And indeed, your performance of my piece with Claire was very much a demonstration of that aspect.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. We had a lot of fun with that piece.
In spite of the subject.
Yeah, I mean, I seem to remember it was pretty tricky, Edwin.
Yep.
We premiered it at it was at the Ryedale Festival in 2014, and then I think we did another one at St Anne's College in Oxford, and you were able to make that one.
That's right, yes, indeed.
It's definitely, yeah.
I'm afraid you can blame John Wallace for that, because when I wrote my trumpet concerto for him in the Philharmonia many years ago, one of the things he really pressed on me was that so many composers think of the trumpet as a kind of arpeggio and scale instrument, and in fact what I want is a lot of chromaticism. And I thought that was a rather brave thing to say, certainly to me. And so it gave me free rein to actually write in a chromatic concept rather than an old-fashioned language, which he didn't want to operate with. And I felt this was very much the same with you, that you wanted a challenge, and not a technical challenge, but an artistic musical challenge. And I felt that to really ignore the arpeggio and scale aspect of the trumpet, mainly because, of course, you now have a valve trumpet rather than a piston. and there's more facility involved. So I took full advantage of that aspect of the technical characteristic of the instrument. My gosh, did you meet the challenge?
And then also, this was your first time writing specifically about World War One. And what was it about the subject matter, as well as the technical challenges, and writing for Simon as a performer that really drew you to that? And what kind of process of thought did that begin to kind of kick off within you writing about World War One?
Well, the subject very much impressed me and involved me right away, because the nurse, the subject of the opera, was treated in an appalling way by the male-dominated bureaucrats of the period, rather like Johnson's government today, I think. And you but it was male-dominated bureaucracy, and she suffered from it appallingly, with the kind of form that she had to fill in to get help with the trauma that she experienced during the war. The nurses, as you well know, one of your main subjects, well, they were committed to just as much appalling experience during the war as the soldiers, the male soldiers. And this was never really fully documented. I mean, for instance, all the poets of the First World War were male. Unless you can correct me, I don't know of any female poets. But a couple of exceptions, like E. Cummings of the Enormous Room, the American poet and giant, who was actually imprisoned by the French in the First World War. And his experience of that actually is much more objective rather than subjective, like the poets. And Robert Graves, too, I think, in his book, demonstrated his awareness of the cruelty that was actually attached to the nurse's experience. And for the male-dominated bureaucracy after the war to treat her in this way really moved me very, very much indeed when I saw the actual document itself. And of course, the opera is very much related to that document and the nurse's response to it. And so therefore, I felt while I was writing it, I was always considering the drama of the nausea in the process as well. And this actually dug in very, very deeply, mainly because I've always been very, very concerned about the literary response to the First World War being, again, male-dominated, and not enough about the subject of its opera.
Mm. Yes, I suppose it's interesting that the source material that we've been talking about for Her War is not poetry but prose. In this instance,
Yes.
it is a pension claim form document from a nurse named Grace Hughes, and so she just has to kind of fill out the very, in some ways, mundane details of where she served, and and where she lived before and after, but then she has to kind of detail her condition. And there's this term that they oftentimes use: was your condition attributable to or aggravated by the war? So they were looking for excuses to discount and sort of say, oh, well, you already had this before. And I've been reminded as well by our collaborators, History Needs You, that when women presented what were then kind of unexplicable symptoms, which I think we might think of as physiological now, or related to mental health issues, they would be treated for insanity. That was just the go-to, because you're a woman, you're hysterical. Thank you, Freud. And there was still that idea. So, and there's so little understanding of shell shock even at the time. But that is so helpful. Just I can certainly, as a singer, I can feel your heart in it. Just this and it's the sense of your anger at her treatment, really kind of in the way that you've set that, and just your sense of empathy and compassion that comes through loud and strong. So why did you want to take on this project in particular? So you've sort of said it was the subject matter, and was it just a direct continuation of what you'd done with Simon? But not everybody would actually be willing to be like, yes, let's write an opera for soprano and trumpet only. So what kind of pushed you over the line to decide that this was something you wanted to do?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And the first thing I want to say is that you were very much involved at the outset, but I'd never met you and I didn't know you. And therefore, I took on faith Simon's friendship with you and his recommendation for the project with you involved. So right away, I was very enthusiastic because I've always very, very much enjoyed working with Simon, and I knew that whatever the problems or difficulties, there would always be a good solution with Simon, and of course by his recommendation for you as well. And I must say that when I actually heard you sing for the first time, I was absolutely overwhelmed by the beauty of your voice and the artistry of your singing. So very, very much. Although I hadn't heard you sing while I was writing it, only just one or two moments to discuss register and things of that sort. I was still convinced that Simon's recommendation was really part of how I thought about your character and vocal character as well in writing the piece. And so therefore I felt that there wasn't any real challenge except the relationship with the trumpet to the voice. The solution to that for me was that, well, first of all, the problem was that the trumpet is a very much more um, dominating instrument than the human voice. And combining the two with absolutely nothing else in obviously required very intensive polyphony, but were both the instruments, the voice and the trumpet, had the same and equal characteristic in the dialogue itself. So rather than uh, barriers on the stage and things of this sort to stifle the domination of the trumpet, I decided to use a vast number of wonderful mutes that the trumpet has today, and therefore, you know, the character could be changed with the change of a mute as well. And also the balance problem was solved immediately with this solution. So knowing that both of you were aware of the problem or the possible problem, this was a very, very easy solution for it. And so I felt that the challenge there was no longer a problem. And knowing that both of you had virtuosic capabilities, I thoroughly indulged those as well.
Amazing. So when you approach a piece of music and you're trying to think about how you want to structure it, how do you usually kind of break down that process?
Well, for me, it's not a process. I don't like the word process in relation to music. Historians use it a hell of a lot, and I profoundly disagree with the conclusions about most eminent composers, for instance, like Bach. Although he, in Forte, Preludes and Fugues, he utilized, for want of a better word, a system which already existed in Monteverdi. But at the same time, never actually using it as a system for a single piece, individual concept. And of course, at the end of his life, threw the whole thing into the wind by writing the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, chromatic composition. So much of the tonal characteristics of a lot of the rather boring music of the Baroque. I only say a lot, a lot that isn't boring, but Bach was the best demonstration of somebody who did not utilize the system. And so therefore my own approach towards that is never to be involved in fashionable cults like minimalism or anything else, and recognizing that any kind of cult is going to collapse after its manifestation. It can't, because composition really is, how could I put it, spontaneous imagination governed by an inner logic, not a system. Otherwise, you're simply using a process which has been used by hundreds of other people without any distinctive characteristic. One of the problems I think I have with quite a number of Baroque composers. Um, um, the great exceptions are, of course, Bach and Handel and Telemann, and one or two others as well. But I think when it comes to Vivaldi, harmonically boring and very, very much cliche the way through. So my view of system is one that it shouldn't be applied by a real composer. And so, you know, the process of writing this piece, I would put it this way, that a composition is, you create the vocabulary which suits that particular idea and that particular composition. Therefore, each piece has an individual vocabulary. I would say this is very, very true of the poets that I admire, which I've already mentioned. System has absolutely nothing with it, and every single piece being coming. I mean, the way he invented the structure of syntax was an incredible creative process. But I use the word process carefully there because that's the manner of doing it, but not the actual substance. So the substance of the work really must be essentially spontaneous imagination, governed by internal logic.
That's a brilliant phrase. It reminds me a little bit of how I find, well, I write poetry where I'll realize afterwards that it's quite an intricate sort of series of internal rhymes, but I don't set out saying I'm going to rhyme the poem. But as you interlock the ideas, and you sort of find that certain synergies and certain symmetries do arise, and certainly it feels like in this piece there are a lot of little interlocking motifs, and you know, as you say, it's like vocabulary, and it's just sort of fitting together all the, for lack of a better term, like all the little fragments of this woman's thought, and that, you know, just as all of us have these little sort of sets of train tracks that we run along when we think about any topic, and you know, and so this is the thing that you think over and over and over again, and then they'll present in a slightly different way, and like you've done that in the music, so we get these little snippets of music that keep recurring, and then they're transformed, but it's the same thing. You realize, aha, this is that thing again. And so that's, I think, maybe something that we could maybe delve into more in a different context, to give people something to listen for. um, and what about when you set a text? Is it, you know, is it the same when you have words, or is it a little bit different than when it's just what you might call absolute music? Although maybe you hate that term, but music without words.
Not really. I think each piece has its own context. And as I mentioned before, you choose a vocabulary which can interpret that context in a meaningful musical way. So I don't actually set out any rules or policy about a piece. I simply take it on its own merits and allow my imagination to run wildly over all the issues involved in it. And it's always, I mean, for instance, if we're talking about the technique of composition, um, uh, your each composition has a process by which, in a way, it's an adventure of discovery about the ideas you put on paper. When you're starting out, for instance, quite a number of composers have actually set out a scheme or a pattern of events before they write the piece and then fill it out with notes. I can't even conceive of how to do that because the composition will actually, the ideas for the composition when you're writing sketches will actually reveal hundreds and hundreds. So really, with a composer, you don't have a set idea when you begin a piece. You actually set out hundreds of possibilities, and there's no necessarily right one. But the important thing is to make the one you choose work as well as it possibly can.
Mm.
I think your thesis on Hindemith had some elements of that characteristic. And am I right?
Yeah, that is right, Edwin. Yeah, I spent quite a lot of time on that one.
Sure.
Killy, particularly in the early stuff, before he got all sort of caught all of this harmonic language.
The Brahms period, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, exactly. There's some really interesting motivic exploration there. Yeah. So there's something I've been meaning to ask you, Edwin. If you think about the soprano and the trumpet, they're both melody instruments. So how does one go about writing a piece just for two melody instruments when you've got, there's no sort of standard accompaniment, is there?
No, because obviously with only two linear parts, you can't think in 4, 5, 6, or 7, 8 part harmony. But again, taking a good example from Bach, two-part inventions indicate how, in fact, structure the implications of harmonic structure from two-part counterpoint. Mind you, I think my special subject at Cambridge was in fact the Renaissance, so I go back to Lassus and Bird and people like this when it comes to counterpoint. And their solution to that, obviously on a modal level, was absolutely fantastic. And of course, breaking the rules all the time. And that's exactly what I've done here. A few rules have been broken, but essentially the harmonic structure was implied by the polyphony. I have to say that one of the important considerations for me was that April has no harmonic foundation for her own part, and I think the way that she actually kept every single note at the right pitch was a remarkable achievement. I know occasionally I gave a few cues from the trumpet, but essentially that was in my mind as well. That it would be very, very difficult for the singer to actually, after a few bars rest, come in on the right note. So making sure that an appropriate cue is available, part of the creative process as well. It's amazing how practicalities can actually initiate an artistic result, an artistic solution. And I think that all these things were taken into account while I was writing the piece. In other words, you see something that's impossible, then don't write it, find another solution. As I was saying before, with composition, there are 100 possibilities from which you can choose which direction you're going to take. And very often these solutions are dictated partly by the practicalities of the issue.
I have to say, I am so grateful that you were mindful of me in this, because I think so often when you do music by living composers, even if you do have other parts with you, you look at it and you're like, and where am I supposed to find my note? So you get really good at kind of, just having a good memory for intervals, but you just in those practicalities, you were so kind in just giving me little things to hang on to, and it's these little things that you can just remember. Oh yeah, that I just sang that note, so I can just keep that in my mind, for when I sing it here, or giving me the note in the trumpet. And so as a singer, I thought, oh, thank God this is really well written, where it's and not just an amazing piece, but really well written for voice. So it makes complete sense, exactly as you're saying, that I could tell you were keeping me in mind, and trying to kind of avoid the slight look of panic in the eyes of like, how am I going to find my note?
Without making it too obvious.
Yeah,
right. I'm very lucky in that I was head chorister of Liverpool Cathedral when I was a kid. And so I learned a lot about production and how to keep on the right note. So I was very lucky with my education there. It was a wonderful experience. And I've always been very, very much involved and adore all good choral music and indeed opera, of course. So I think you made the perfect Eloise in my opera about Abelard and Eloise.
Oh, what a fascinating topic that is. We'll have to talk more about that another time.
Indeed.
Simon, some of the particular project challenges for you, because it's amazing writing that Edwin's given you, but it's not the absolute easiest. So talk me through kind of the journey that you've gone on with it to date.
So I mentioned that Edwin had written me a piece in 2014 for trumpet and piano, and there was some of the challenges came up again. So it sort of brought some memories back. So generally speaking, if you take a phrase in isolation, it's not particularly standout difficult. There are a couple that are tricky. Actually, the very opening is quite tricky, and particularly the top D. I think it's the second line.
On the C trumpet, yes.
Yeah, that's pretty tough. But what happens is, when I'm learning new pieces, I won't attempt to run for quite a while, and I'll just focus on little snippets and try and get my head around it. And I do that, but it's only when I put it all together. It's exactly what happened before as well. It's when I put it all together, that's the real challenge. Because it's a real stamina thing. I think particularly in this piece, because obviously the trumpet needs to play for a lot because there are only two instruments the whole time anyway. So it has to feature constantly, and that's very, very difficult because for us trumpet players, it's not the small things, it's the long scale drain that's very, very difficult. So I think that's what's been most on my mind these last few weeks.
Right.
Is building the kind of stamina for it. It's not unreasonable by any means. I'm not even suggesting that. And actually, I quite relish it, if I'm honest. I like the excuse to have that sort of physical workout. It's very difficult to motivate yourself when you practice to build up stamina. When as a trumpet player, when you're working on your practice routines, and let's say there's no big concert coming up in the next few weeks, whatever, then you might be thinking, okay, well, I might want to be just working on my articulation a bit at the moment, getting a little bit more definition, or I might experiment with some range studies, bit of flexibility, that sort of thing. But having the kind of motivation to say, do you know what, I want to build up my stamina so that I can play for half an hour non-stop or whatever, is actually not something one tends to do with the motivation of a piece or a performance at the end of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually, I like I said, I kind of relish that having this purpose in my practice at the moment of having to build up the necessary stamina to do this. But your question, April, it's putting all the pieces together, playing it as a whole run. That's by far the biggest challenge for me.
That's interesting because obviously Stravinsky might have been well advised by you in for instance, one of the trumpet solos in Pulcinello, top C, dozens of times over and over again. But I guess you pop that note rather than sustain it. And so it makes it easier in a way. So Stravinsky could have learned something from your comment as well. Thank you.
I think for me, one of the things that's been the most interesting, just as a little motif that occurs again and again and again, is the tritone. So for those who aren't kind of huge music geeks, the tritone used to be called the devil's interval. It's either known as as diminished fifth or augmented fourth. It's that ba ba. So it's the quintessential dissonance, and it is all over this piece. It's if you kind of did the percentages, I'm sure it would be at least 75% of every interval is it's tritones. But I think that's genius because you're dealing with someone who has this complete cognitive dissonance, who's kind of has this interrupted process herself of trying to come to terms with what's happened to her. So she's stuck in this anger and this trauma, and so in some ways the tritone was the absolute perfect basis for it harmonically. But it's weirdly, like, even though it's the most dissonant, like dissonant of the intervals, in terms of vocal memory, Well, it's actually one of the easiest oftentimes to remember because, to kind of latch on to, because like, yep, I know that. Whereas things like major minor sevenths or ninths, like, when you've got those really big leaps, those can be a little bit harder. But tritones actually, like, that's fine. But then it's funny how sometimes things like the sixth and fourths that are more consonants, that are easier on the ear, then become a little bit harder to orient. You have to kind of trust. You're like, oh, this is a consonant interval. This is a normal interval, and so to kind of all these little tiny calibrations from interval to interval, because I suppose unlike Simon, I don't have a place that I can put my fingers that will, I mean, yes, I know in combination with the embouchure, but which will give me that note. It's all about that little adjustment from, the vocal folds extend, the vocal folds, contract. And so it's the closest thing is trombone, maybe, like the idea that they have to kind of, extend, and so it's kind of like the vocal folds are doing that to try and kind of find my way around those things. But again, there is such a beautiful internal logic in the piece. And when you ask me to do big leaps and go quite high, again, you've done it kindly. So I sort of thought, okay, it's not the easiest, but but actually, also, knowing that I would be moving this and potentially going through quite an intense, dramatic journey, you didn't give me quite so much to do with Simon. So would you like to just talk a little bit about the psychology of the piece, and just in your mind, in terms of who the trumpet was at any particular time, or what role it was playing? Because it feels like there are very distinct characters in the piece where the trumpet kind of shifts function. Just want to kind of tell us a little bit about what you were thinking?
Well, there are 2 points to answer there. First of all, about the augmented fourth, which you don't. I mean, that actually is part of the language I constantly use, part of the heptatonic scale, in fact, which Debussy used in his full tone scale. And I'm not alone in that. And in fact, I've always found one of our great English composers, Gustav Holst, a great inspiration from that point of view. I mean, the planets, the augmented fourth is part of the most important part of Mars, da, dee, da, da, all over the place. And of course, it's an essential part of the Saturn in the Saturn movement. And so I've always been very much a fan of Holst, and surprisingly, he died before I was born, more or less. But still, very much rather like the influence of any great composer like Bach or Beethoven on any composer who really wants to learn how to compose. And so the augmented fourth is a very, very integral part of the intervallic material that I'm attracted to in writing most of my music. So that was the reason for that. And your second point, just repeat it again.
Was about the role the trumpet played in the different parts, because it felt like psychologically it was playing a slightly different role.
Oh, yes.
To me.
Well, one of the issues which I thought a lot about before putting pen to paper, as it were, was how I could actually explain why such an unusual combination of voice and trumpet was the basis for this piece. And so I thought, really, as it's a mini opera, as it were, then, as Simon mentioned before, making the trumpet into one of the characters in the opera would actually resolve that issue. And so I made him into the voice of the bureaucrat, and he'll do very, very convincingly. The issue there is that the trumpet can be on stage as a character on stage, and therefore I felt the music had to demonstrate that and illustrate that as closely as possible. So he's the polyphonic element there is that the body is the bureaucratic element, where in the subject matter of the opera. Then his part in the polyphony, always a kind of not an irritation, but a kind of agitation towards you, and therefore his part of the polyphony is always much more active than yours. because it's he's really getting under your skin all the time. And
Yeah.
I'm
Much
sorry to
better.
I'm sorry to put the trumpet into that characterization, but it certainly was the ideal solution to the issue of the relationship between the trumpet and the soprano, and also very symbolic in that the only one of the few times you actually hear the trumpet without a mute, or played very quietly. You hear the suggestion of the last post right at the very end. Of course, is symbolic. The condition of the poor nurse's mind.
There are some really contrasting parts where we are more in duet. And so, Simon, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about how you feel that the way that the voices talk to each other in that counterpoint is a bit different? How does that feel different in character?
Yeah, so I mean, I take Edwin's point about the trumpet as a kind of antagonism, as the unsympathetic bureaucrat. But yeah, there are a couple of points where the trumpet plays some much more lyrical material, forms a counterpoint with the soprano. And yeah, at that point, I think we've sort of gone with the trumpet playing a slightly different role, and maybe either becoming slightly more sympathetic to the position of the soprano, or perhaps even becoming some sort of amplification of what the soprano is actually thinking at the time. So slightly playing around, I think, with how to do that, and we've been looking as well at how we're sort of positioning the trumpet. Then, a little bit of movement. We're going to stand side by side at that point.
Yeah, so the psychology it's difficult to translate that into artistic terms, and you're quite right. There are moments where, in fact, there's a sympathetic polyphony between you and the soprano, and in a way, you could interpret that as being that even a bureaucratic male is without conscience, and therefore has some sympathy with the nurse's position. And after all, the bureaucrat didn't actually write the questionnaire.
When there were some people on the panel who were more sympathetic. And so I think maybe this is something we might be able to explore more as we see at later parts, and to sort of think that there were, for instance, there were some of the medical experts, who were brought in to examine, who had dealt more with shell shock, and so they kind of understood more what they were actually dealing with, and they came in with more compassion. And then there were some who were there to basically just, weed out the slackers and sort of say, you're just trying to play the system, and hopefully we can sort of build on what you've done to really sort of show that, well, I suppose as with all of us, there's a combination of different kinds of human beings. There are some who are genuinely there to wish to help. And I think also just the scale of the task that was facing these pension tribunals was just unprecedented. To actually be saddled with trying to weigh somebody's experience and put a monetary figure on that. And because they'd never had to do this, they hadn't fought in the wars themselves. So I think there had to be some individuals who just sat there and thought, I have no idea how to do this. And to me, like the trumpet in those sections is maybe talking a little bit about those truths.
Well, Simon has just set up the next fact. That's where we go from here.
Amazing. So Edwin, what aspect of the music are you most interested to see translated into a staged version?
Sorry, don't quite understand.
So essentially, it's this gap between the music as it's kind of as it exists in the composer's mind, and then you've now kind of heard it performed by us once in our last rehearsal, but it then becomes a different creature when it's when there's movement, when it's on a stage. So what are you most interested to sort of see? Is it are you slightly apprehensive to think, oh, is it going to be what I expected, or when it's in front of me on a stage, or maybe you could speak from your experience with Eloise Nabelard. to
Well,
sort
well,
of.
yes. Well, what you're saying is interesting in that, with an opera, whether a small one like this or a major one, the composer's always got to be aware of the fact that a producer is going to be leading the production itself and really what goes on stage. And I think the most important part of a composer's contribution to that is really the kind of instructions that go in the score. For instance, in my main opera, there are constant production instructions, but the way they're interpreted by an individual producer is not necessarily in the hands of the composer. So I think you always have to keep in mind that adapting to production proposals must be part of your first idea. And the more convincingly you can explain to the producer what you had in mind, then the more effective it could be. And also accepting the fact that you might have it wrong because you are not a producer. Therefore, the stage is very much in the hands of an expert, and which you're not. My first job was as principal oboe in what was what is now the English National Opera, Sadler's Wells. And I had 3 years of a vast range of operas to get under my skin, including every single one, the first production of all Janacek's operas in 2 years. It was a wonderful experience for me, and I learned so much from being involved in that process. So the experience I had there actually has informed what I actually thought about in writing your piece. That the production elements, especially when you're aware of the comments and the issues that are brought up in its probe rehearsals and things like that in the opera house, all that, even on a very mini scale, the actual issues involved were very much part of my awareness of what was going on while I wrote what I did. And you'll notice, for instance, that there are quite a number of pauses I hope are made effective, so that the trumpet can change mute. And things of that sort. These are practical issues which are all part of the production.
But they also happened to be at dramatic beats, so they were at hinges.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's perfectly done. I have to sort of say that as we were in the process of staging, a lot of it kind of suggested itself, just that what you had produced for us was so clear in its intent that it made the job of kind of staging and realizing it quite easy. It felt a little bit like that, didn't it, Simon? Where we just thought, oh yeah, well that's how that goes, and
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
it was not kind of what we thought.
Hey, so on that note, I think we should probably. I think we should probably wrap up there.
Brilliant.
Yes, indeed.
But Edwin, thanks for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure, as it has been for the whole project, and looking forward to seeing the final result.
Yeah. Yeah,
so thank you ever so much for being so helpful in the process of doing it, and it's been a wonderful experience, and I've enjoyed. Can't wait for the next act.
Oh, me too, Edwin. So for everyone watching, so we've got the premieres next week. It's on Friday, the 18th of September, and that's placed in the Cockpit Theatre in London at 7 p.m. April, we've got a digital launch as well, haven't we?
Yeah, on the 22nd at 6 p.m. And yeah, so we're aware that a lot of people are not going to be able to get to the live show for various reasons. So if you can't, please join us for the digital broadcast. There's a bit of audience interaction as well. But we'd really welcome your input on the Q&A as well. So we
how do we find the digital one?
I think we'll make sure that there's a link to this below this video in the description. But also, so if you just search Tête-à-Tête 2020 Her War, and then there's a What's On tab, so you can sort of see what's on the whole festival, and you just go down to the 22nd.
And this of course will come in some of the advertising that.
So we'll just we'll post that. Yeah, so they can see.
Yes.
Yeah, you just go to the What's On tab of the Tête-à-Tête page and go down to our one, which is on the 22nd, which will say the interactive broadcast.
Okay, so both the cases have been in touch with you, have they?
Yeah,
KTB's good. That's fine. Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we're putting it out there for them. And this is a work in progress performance of just the first part of what we think will be maybe 3, potentially 4 parts. So our wonderful librettist, Jonathan Ruffle, has kind of outlined where he thinks it might go. From here on, we're going to keep that under wraps for now. But I really feel like, Edwin, you've, between you and Jonathan, you've given us such a wonderful core for kind of a really kind of seminal and really important work that's not just about these historical women, but that's also kind of highlighting the continuing experience of people of tribunals and of that kind of injustice. So we're really excited to continue to develop that, hopefully in 2021.
Yes, well, I must say that Jonathan made it very easy for me. It's a wonderful script. Lovely to see you both and keep in touch.
Great to see you.
Bye for now.
Great to see you. Yeah, okay, bye for now. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.